you ever have those moments where you just want to throw up your hands? You've kind of given up hope. You don't see how what you have can deal with what you're facing. And this is all you know what to do. Sometimes it's just at the end of a really bad day. You got yelled at by your boss. Things went wrong. And what else could you do? You just throw your hands up. Other times it's when you're in these really serious places. Like when you get a diagnosis from the doctor you weren't expecting, or when you're grieving a loved one and people around you want to argue about something petty. And you can't deal with it anymore. A lot of times it comes when we look around at the world and see these needs that are real and are so much bigger than what we can do something about. At least that's how it feels. Kids that are neglected, people with addictions, those suffering and wanting to commit suicide, soldiers coming back with PTSD, homelessness, the list just kind of goes on and on and on. And when you catch glimpses of these things and you start to realize what a big problem it is, what a big need it is, you kind of throw your hands up. Because what are you supposed to do? The only things that feel like they'll work are huge and big and grand, right? Because that's how you deal with big problems, with big solutions. I mean, that's how we feel about it most of the time. And if I can't bring a big solution, then what am I supposed to do about the big problems? And so I throw my hands up and I walk away from it and I give up hope of being able to do something to fix whatever it is that has come before me. The problem is that if we really follow Jesus, He doesn't give us a lot of room to throw up our hands and give up hope. He doesn't give us a lot of room to be able to say, you know what, just ignore whatever it is that you've just seen. Because if He really is the creator of the universe, if He really is someone who's conquered sin and death, and if He really is with us, then we don't get the luxury of losing hope. We have to be people who have hope even in the face of such big, incredibly overwhelming need. But we can't just do what everyone else has to do, right? We have to live a certain way. And so we have to live in a way that's different. And St. Benedict years ago said that your way of acting should be different from the world's way. The love of Christ must come before all else. The love of Christ must come before all else. In other words, what does love have me to do in this situation? And if we see lots of shows or we understand things ourselves, when we want to show big love, we want to do big displays, right? Big need means big solution. Big love means big displays. That's how we think about these things. That's how we market reality shows and romantic comedies and big displays. It used to be if you wanted to show your love, you'd go and wipe out the neighboring village and then come back with the plunder and say, see how much I love you. I love you above all else. And if that's really how we're supposed to deal with things, then where does that put those of us who are more limited in what we have to offer, that are not up to the challenge of meeting the unceasing and overwhelming needs around us? Jesus was having one of those overwhelming kind of moments in Mark chapter 6. His cousin John the Baptist had just been beheaded, and he had been alone when he found out about that, because he'd sent his disciples off to minister, and they were getting ready to come back and rejoin with him. But in the meantime, he had to come and learn that news and kind of deal with it. I don't know about you, but when that kind of news hits you, I don't usually think it's good to be by yourself. And so he finally had the disciples come back and meet with him, and they're trying to reconnect. They're trying to share what has been going on in each other's lives. They're trying to deal with all of these things that have been happening, and they can't do it because they keep being interrupted by people coming that want to get close to them, that want somebody to be healed or a word of wisdom or a dispute settled. And so at the end of the day, they haven't even had a chance to stop and eat, much less do the things that they need to do together, and they're exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally. And Jesus says, fellas, why don't we get in your boat and let's go across the lake to a more remote place that we can just kind of rest and restore ourselves after what we've just gone through. The problem is, people saw them getting in the boat and leaving and knew where they were headed. And so while they're going and taking their time across the lake, these people are running to all of the surrounding villages to tell them where Jesus is going to be, so that when they land, they are met with probably 5,000 men plus women and children, so 20,000 people gathered in their remote getaway location. Now just imagine that this was your situation, okay? So think of it. You're going on a vacation finally because your mental health kind of depends on it. You need this break. You have done so much and you've got to get away from everything else and just regain your sense of strength and calling and purpose and all of that. And when you show up, waiting for you is your boss with all of your work that you just left, plus some more work that you didn't even know was coming, and just drops it as soon as you get to your destination. How would you feel? What would your reaction be in that situation? I probably would have just got back in the boat and turned around and said, we'll just stay out at sea because I can't deal with this right now. But this is how Jesus responds in this place. It says, when Jesus landed and he saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Compassion. He didn't feel sorry for them, which is just pity and move on. He didn't say, oh, I understand how they feel, and that's good enough, which is empathy. But he said, I understand these people have need, and I will do what I can to help alleviate it. Compassion called Jesus to action. And so instead of resting, he gathered the people around to teach them, to give what he had to their need. And while this is happening, the disciples who also care for the people and are going along with this realize that there's a problem brewing that they really don't want to deal with. By this time it was late in the day. So his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said. It's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. They've got 15,000 plus people to feed, and they don't know how to do it. There's this huge need that is overwhelming to them. And so instead of just dealing with it and figuring out how to solve it, they're like, we will eliminate it and ignore it and get rid of it. So we'll make all these 15,000 people leave, and that way their hunger is their own problem and not ours. And that way, they'll be okay, and we'll be okay, and everything will be good. We can get back to this vacation that we had planned. Because can you imagine what all those people would be like if they got hungry? I mean, really hungry? I mean, it'd be the Snickers commercials all over again. It would be unruly. People get grouchy and angry, and blood sugar drops, and it is not a pretty scene. Multiply that by 15,000, and you've got some ugliness waiting for you if you don't deal with this problem. And Jesus understood that, but his response to them wasn't exactly what they expected, because what they were saying made the most sense. They were limited, they couldn't deal with this, so let's just not deal with it. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. And so they said back, that would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? All they could think about was how impossible it would be to do these big things, because in their mind, big problem meant big solution. And the big solution was to go and buy bread for all of these people, which, one, they didn't have the money for, and two, which would require them to go and leave where they were in the remote areas and go visit all these different villages so they could get enough bread and then bring it and transport it all back and pass it out. How were they supposed to do that? They didn't have the transportation, they didn't have the time, they didn't have the money. Because all they could think of was big problem, big solution. But it could be that Jesus had something else in mind for them to do instead. And so as I read this next part of the story, listen, what are the things that Jesus actually asked the people to do? "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he also divided the 2 fish among them all. Instead of asking them to do big things, Jesus asked them to do little things. Things that on the surface of them won't solve the problem. In fact, they seem almost like a waste of time. What is figuring out what you really have and realizing you have one kid's lunch really going to do? What does having the people get in groups, what is that going to do? What does passing out the food that you have really going to do in face of such a big need? But that's the problem with what Jesus asks of us a lot of times, isn't it? We're looking for these big, grand solutions. And he's saying, why don't you do the small things first? Why don't you do just this little step? Why don't you do just this little thing and then see what happens? Because little things done as acts of obedience, little things done in our love for Christ, result in big things happening. They all ate and were satisfied. It's so understated. All of these people, every one of them, ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. Everyone ate with 12 doggy bags left over, basically, is what happened. This little act of obedience plus little act of obedience ended up leading to a miracle, which is one of the only ones that is recorded in all 4 Gospels in the New Testament. You see, this is how we truly live differently. This is how we put the love of Christ above all else. Instead of looking for something that makes sense to ourselves all of the time, in the face of overwhelming need, of overwhelming pain, of overwhelming disaster, or whatever it is you're facing, instead of looking for these big, grand solutions and feeling hopeless because you can't live up to that and you can't deliver on that, start doing the little things that God asks you to do. And those little things, with his presence and power, will make all of the difference. Mother Teresa described it this way. Her definition of greatness was to do little things with great love. And so maybe it isn't as complicated as we sometimes make it out to be. I just have to do what Jesus is asking me to do that's little. And it will make the big difference. Some of the things we've talked about over the last couple of weeks fit with this really well. When you are overwhelmed with your to-do list and the list of activities and the things that are straining your energy, why don't you just do the little thing that doesn't seem to make sense? Like when your to-do list is too big, why would you stop and pause? Because then you're not being productive. But that stopping, that pausing, that Sabbath leads to the breakthrough. When all of the voices in the world are trying to tell you who you are and what you should believe and how you should act and what you should do with your life and all these other things, what does it do when you just pause for 5-10 minutes every day and talk to God and listen to his words? And could those few minutes that seem so insignificant in the amount of time that you spend be all the difference you need to actually hear the voice of the one who made you instead of the voices of everyone who wants to use you? Small things done in obedience lead to the breakthrough. And these small acts can be acts of generosity, acts of encouragement, acts of kindness, and the ones that you do, you have no idea what might be unlocked on the other side of them. One of the things that happened to me that was a bedrock of my faith, that is bedrock of my faith, is we were at a place in our life where we didn't know where we were going to eat, much less pay the rent. And we made a commitment to God, and I was throwing up my hands because the needs that we had were so much bigger than what I could do about it. And about 20 minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and someone brought in a couple of bags of groceries. Not a whole lot, but just a few things. They had gone to the grocery store, bought their own list, and on their way home, it felt like they should give them to us. And they listened to that small act. As soon as they left, I asked them where they were going. They said, well, I got to go back to the grocery store, buy the same things all over again for our list for the week. But those things gave us a couple of meals, but what they really gave me was hope and a trust that God was going to see us through no matter what we found ourselves in. There was another time we were on our honeymoon, and we were caught in the rainstorm. We're on the public transportation. I'm ready to go back to the hotel and get dry, and this guy comes on at the next stop, and he's carrying on 2 or 3 loads worth of groceries. Can't carry them all at once. And he sits down. It looks like he's crying, but you can't really tell because it's raining. And I'm not really paying attention to all this. I'm just concerned about myself. And Megan keeps nudging me, hey, we need to help this guy. Let's tell him we're going to carry his groceries back for him. Tell him. And I didn't want to do it. I kept saying no. But she was listening to someone who was more important than me. And so finally she convinced me. We went up and we talked and we said, hey, can we carry these for you? And we'll take them to your house. And it ended up being about a half-mile walk off the bus to carry the bags there. We helped him put them away, and then he had us sit down, and he told us that he had prepared to come and make one great last meal for his life, and then he was going to go to sleep and not wake up, because he believed that no one noticed him and no one would miss him when he was gone. And because we were willing to see him on that bus and carry his bags back for him, he knew that someone noticed him. Someone cared about him. And that changed what he was planning to do that night. You never know what your small act will unleash. Small things done with great love. When you do it that way, then whatever you're overwhelmingly faced, you don't have to worry about that. Instead of giving up hope, instead of throwing up your hands, just do the small things that God has said to do. Do the small things that don't look like they should make sense, that don't look like they will do the thing that needs to happen, but just keep doing them and see what God will unleash. In fact, why don't you do that before we wrap up today? What is it that is overwhelming you? What small thing is God asking you to do in the face of what's overwhelming you? That small thing, if you're willing to do it, might lead to a breakthrough you didn't expect. Several years ago in Iran, there was a couple of believers who were arrested and put in prison, and they were basically tortured, given very little food and water, and left there hoping that they would succumb and give up and die. And when they were at the place where they were about ready to give up and die, one of them said that he really wished that he could have communion one more time. And so as they sat there in the cell, they had communion. One person would lead them, and the other one would hold up nothing, just air, and say, "This is the body of Christ, which is broken for you." And he would pass that broken air out to the others in the cell, and they would take together. Then the cup of air was lifted, and nothing was there, but they blessed and they passed it amongst each other. And they said that at the end of that time, they felt strength that they had never felt the whole time they were there. And that became their practice each night, to go through these small, simple things. I mean, it didn't seem to make any sense. What was doing that going to really do to give them strength, to help them survive? But it was those simple acts of communion with air where the presence of God came upon them and strengthened them and gave them what they needed to survive until they were able to be released and set free. Without that, they would have died in those cells. Small acts can unleash big things when you do it because Christ has asked you to do it. And if the one who loves you asks, and the one that you love asks, then you do it with great love, even when it doesn't seem to make sense in the face of such overwhelming need. And if each of us would go through life doing those sorts of things, I have no idea what will happen, but I do know that a lot of these big and overwhelming things that we find in the world will become smaller and will be conquered by the power of the one who lives in us. Lord, I pray that as we think about the things that are overwhelming us today, that you would give us your strength and your peace to not give up hope. And we would listen to your voice. And when your voice says, "Hey, why don't you try this?" Even when it seems impossible, instead of trying to think of these big, grand things right away, why don't we start with the small steps of obedience? Even ones that seem like waste of time. And as we do what you've asked of us, may we see you move in ways we never have before, so that the needs get met and the overwhelming forces back down, and we prove again and again and again how great you are. Help us, Lord. We pray these things in your name. Amen.